Apologize now." The word didn't sound loud, but it cut clean through the room like something sharper than anger. I remember the way the glass in his hand stopped halfway to his lips, the way his eyes locked on me, not curious, not confused, but certain. Like he'd just seen a ghost he recognized. And then Mark laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not even a polite one, just a short, dismissive chuckle. "Come on, Uncle Frank," he said, "it's just a nickname." That's when I knew the evening was already over. Not the dinner, not the conversation. Something else. Something quieter and harder to put back together. A few hours earlier, I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside the house in Fairfax, Virginia, engine idling longer than it should have. It was one of those neighborhoods built in the late 80s, two-story colonials, trimmed hedges, American flags on front porches. The kind of place where people knew each other's routines and waved from driveways. Normal. That word had always felt like something I borrowed, not something I owned. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. Hair pulled back, light makeup I'd had to relearn how to use a navy blouse that didn't quite feel like me. No uniform, no rank, no gear, just a woman going to a family dinner. I turned off the engine. Just dinner, I told myself. I'd handled worse. Inside the house smelled like roast chicken garlic and something sweet baking in the oven. Warm lighting, voices overlapping, silverware clinking, someone laughing too loudly in the kitchen. My sister-in-law Jenna spotted me first. "Evie, you made it." She crossed the room and hugged me before I had time to prepare for it. I stood there a second longer than most people would, then returned it. "Wouldn't miss it," I said. That part wasn't entirely true. But Jenna didn't need to know that. She pulled me into the living room, introducing me to people whose names I immediately forgot. Cousins, in-laws, neighbors who might as well be family. Faces blurred together, smiles, polite nods, quick glances that lingered just a second too long. People always looked twice. Not because they knew who I was. Because they didn't. And something about that made them curious. Mark was leaning against the doorway between the living room and dining area when I first saw him. My brother-in-law. Jenna's husband. He had that easy confidence some men wear like a second skin arms, crossed half-smile already in mid-conversation with someone about golf or investments, or something equally distant from my world. When Jenna introduced us, he gave me a once-over. Not rude, not exactly. Just measuring. "So you're Evie," he said. "Heard you're Navy." I nodded. Was. "Retired already?" he asked, eyebrows lifting. "You don't look that old." "I'm not." He chuckled like we were already sharing a joke. Must have been a desk job then. I didn't respond. Silence has a way of making people fill it. But Mark just shrugged and turned back to his conversation like he'd already figured me out. That was fine. Most people think they have. We sat down for dinner around 6. Long wooden table, white plates, cloth napkins folded just right. Someone had gone through the trouble of making it feel like an occasion. I took a seat near the middle, not at the head, not tucked away at the end. Neutral ground. Across from me sat an older man I hadn't met yet, late 70s, maybe early 80s, straight posture, clear eyes, hands steady even as he lifted his glass. He didn't say much at first. Just watched. Not in a suspicious way. In a familiar one. Conversation started easy. Weather, traffic, the wedding coming up that weekend. Stories about how Jenna and Mark met, retold for the benefit of the older relatives who liked hearing them again. I listened more than I spoke. That's what I've always done. Out there, listening kept you alive. In here, it just made people think you were shy. Halfway through the meal, the conversation shifted the way it always does. From general to personal. "So Evie," someone down the table said, "what exactly did you do in the Navy?" A simple question. I took a sip of water before answering. Special operations. That usually ended it. Not because people understood, but because they didn't. And most folks over a certain age know when not to push. But Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Special operations, huh?" There it was again. That tone. Curious but edged. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. "Various assignments," I said. He smiled. "Sounds classified." I gave a small shrug. Some of it is. A few people chuckled politely. Mark didn't. He tilted his head, studying me like a puzzle he wanted to solve. Then he said it. So, you're in the Navy? I nodded once. He smirked. What's your nickname? The room didn't go silent right away. Not yet. There's always a moment, that small space, where something could still go either way. I could have deflected. Made a joke. Changed the subject. But I didn't. I looked at him steady. And I answered. Mad Dog. A couple of people laughed. Light, uncertain. Like they thought I was playing along. Then I saw the man across from me. The older one. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes didn't leave mine. And just like that, everything changed. Apologize now. His voice was low, but it carried. Every conversation at the table stopped. Mark blinked. Excuse me. The old man didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. You heard me, he said. Apologize. Mark let out a short laugh, glancing around like he expected backup. Uncle Frank, come on. I didn't say anything. Yes, you did. The words landed heavier this time. Mark's smile started to fade. And for the first time that evening, someone else in the room understood exactly what had just happened. I set my fork down gently. I'm fine, I said. But Uncle Frank didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on Mark. No, he said quietly, you're not. And neither was the room anymore. Nobody reached for a fork after that. The roast chicken cooled on the serving platter. The green beans sat untouched in their dish with the toasted almonds still glistening under the dining room light. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer went off and kept beeping until Jenna hurried away to silence it. Even that ordinary little sound felt strange in the middle of the quiet. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I've lived through gunfire, rotor wash, and radio chatter so loud it rattled my bones, but I've learned that some of the heaviest moments in life happen in a room where nobody says a thing. Mark looked from Uncle Frank to me and back again. What is this? He asked, trying to laugh it off, though the laughter had already thinned out. Seriously, did I miss something? Uncle Frank finally set his glass down. Carefully, deliberately. His face had gone still in a way I recognized right away. Men of his generation wore certain expressions only when memory had taken hold of them. You asked her that question like it was a joke, he said. Mark spread his hands. It was a question. It was a challenge, Frank replied. I could feel every eye at the table shifting between us. Jenna came back in from the kitchen, took one look around and stopped short. What happened? No one answered her for a second. Then Mark said, apparently I committed some kind of crime by asking your sister what her nickname is. Sister-in-law Jenna corrected automatically, then looked at me. Evie. I'm all right, I said. That was the truth, at least on the surface. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't angry. I was tired, maybe. Tired in that old, familiar way that had nothing to do with sleep. The thing about a nickname is that most people think it's a story they're entitled to hear. Something colorful, something entertaining. A little badge you wear so others can feel closer to danger without ever having to stand near it. But some names are really just receipts. Proof of what something cost. Frank drew in a breath and looked directly at me for the first time since he'd spoken. Did I hear you right? He asked. I nodded once. You did. He held my gaze for a beat longer than most people could. Then he leaned back in his chair and I saw it register in him all over again. Not excitement, not admiration. Recognition. The kind that doesn't make a person feel bigger. The kind that makes the room smaller. My mother used to say older Americans carry history differently. Not louder, just deeper. They know what it means when a name goes still in a room. Frank was that kind of man. Mark, on the other hand, had never had to learn stillness the hard way. He sat back with a little shrug and said, Okay, somebody help me out here because now I'm curious. That's part of your problem, Frank said. The words were plain, but they landed hard enough to make Jenna wince. Uncle Frank, she said gently, maybe let's all calm down. I am calm. And he was. That was the unsettling part. He wasn't angry in a hot-blooded way. He was angry the way some old men get when they've seen enough in life to know the exact weight of disrespect. Across the table, Aunt Louise cleared her throat softly. Frank, do you know Evie from somewhere? He shook his head. No, not personally. Then he looked at me again. But I know the name. I felt my shoulders tighten even though I kept my face neutral. I'd spent years training my body not to announce discomfort. It's a habit that stays long after the need is gone. Mark caught that sentence and tried to make light of it. "Oh, come on," he said. "What is this, some kind of legend? A ghost story from the Pentagon?" Nobody laughed. That was the moment his face changed, just slightly, the first pale edge of realization. Not because he understood the nickname. Because he understood he was alone in how he was handling it. Frank folded his napkin and laid it beside his plate. "I served in Vietnam," he said. "Different Navy, different century. But I stayed in touch with enough people over the years to know when a name is said with a certain kind of caution." I looked down at my water glass. There are moments when you want to disappear, and people always assume it's because you're ashamed. Most of the time it's the opposite. Most of the time it's because you know that once a room starts looking at you a certain way, they stop seeing the ordinary parts. They stop seeing the woman who forgot to bring the pie server she promised, or the one who sat in her car for 10 minutes gathering the nerve to come inside. They start seeing a story instead. And stories are dangerous things when they stop belonging to you. Frank went on. "I heard that name years ago, not from the news, not from television, in conversations where people didn't use names lightly." Mark shifted in his chair. "You're making this sound ridiculous." "Am I?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. Jenna sat down slowly, not eating, not touching her wine. "Evie," she said softer now, "is this real, the nickname?" "Yes." Her brow furrowed. "Why never mention it?" I gave a tired smile. "Because this is dinner, Jenna, not a deposition." That got a few uneasy smiles around the table. Not laughter exactly, more relief that the world still contained normal rhythms. But Mark wasn't ready to let it settle. "So what, I'm supposed to apologize because she has some tough-sounding nickname from work?" I turned to him then, really turned enough that he had no choice but to meet my eyes. "You don't owe me awe," I said. "You owe people respect before you decide they're lying." That shut him up. Not because I raised my voice, I didn't. At my age and after the life I've lived, I've learned that a steady tone can shame a person more effectively than a shout ever could. Frank nodded once almost to himself. "That's right," he said. "And for what it's worth, son, some names aren't bragging. They're warning labels." The room went quiet again. Not frozen this time, just listening. Outside headlights moved across the front window as a neighbor pulled into a driveway. Somewhere upstairs a toilet flushed. Real life kept going, which somehow made the whole thing feel more grounded, not less. That's how these moments happen in America. Not on a battlefield, not in a movie. At a polished dining table in Northern Virginia beside a bowl of mashed potatoes and a half-finished basket of rolls. Mark looked at his plate for a while before speaking. "I wasn't trying to insult you," he muttered. "I believe that," I said. He looked up surprised. I continued, "But not trying and not doing are two different things." That seemed to reach him more than Frank's sharpness had. People over 60 know this well. Pride doesn't usually break all at once. It gives a little first, then a little more. Frank leaned back, his expression easing just a fraction. "You asked her to perform," he said. "That's what you did. And some people have paid too high a price to do that for the amusement of a dinner table." Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Aunt Louise reached for the green beans and quietly passed them to Jenna, as if mercy could start with something as simple as resuming a meal. It nearly worked. But Mark looked at Frank and asked the question that kept the whole thing from settling. "How do you know that name?" Frank's eyes came back to me. And I knew before he ever opened his mouth that the evening was about to go much deeper than I had wanted. Frank didn't answer right away. At his age, silence wasn't hesitation. It was judgment. He was deciding what belonged in that room and what didn't. That alone told me plenty about the man. Most people, once they think they know something unusual, hurry to show it. Frank was old enough to understand that information has weight. I saved him the trouble. "You don't have to explain it," I said. His eyes stayed on mine. Maybe not, but maybe I should. Mark gave a short exhale through his nose, not quite a laugh this time, more a sign that his patience was wearing thin. "This is unbelievable." "No," Frank said. "It's very believable, that's the problem." The room had shifted into one of those strange family moments where everyone feels trapped between politeness and truth. Jenna looked like she wanted to smooth everything over with dessert and a subject change. Aunt Louise kept folding and unfolding her napkin. Someone near the far end of the table took a sip of water just to have something to do with their hands. Frank rested his forearms on the table. I spent 30 years after Vietnam working around veterans organizations, military charities, and a few federal contractors, he said. You hear things, not gossip, just enough to know which stories carry weight. Mark frowned. So this is hearsay. Frank ignored that. Every now and then, a name came up. Never in detail, never in a way that invited questions. Just a shorthand among people who understood what it meant when a mission went bad and somebody still brought people home. My jaw tightened. I hated hearing it put that way. Not because it was wrong exactly, because it was incomplete. People like clean versions of ugly things, especially at a dinner table. Jenna looked at me almost apologetically. Evie, is any of that true? I kept my voice even, some of it. Mark caught on to that immediately, some of it. That means enough, Frank said. Mark leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. It was the same posture he'd worn when I first came in, but it fit him differently now. Less confidence, more defense. I'm sorry, he said, though he didn't sound sorry yet. I just have a hard time with this. She comes to dinner, barely says 10 words, and suddenly everybody's acting like she's some kind of secret war hero. I looked straight at him. I didn't ask anybody to do that. No, he said, but you could clear it up. That was the first honest thing he'd said all night. He didn't want drama, he wanted certainty. People his age and younger often think certainty is their birthright. Folks over 60 usually know better. They've lived long enough to understand that sometimes the truth comes in jagged pieces and you either respect the edges or you get cut. Frank spoke before I did. You want her to satisfy your curiosity, he said. That's not the same thing as clearing it up. Mark's face reddened. I want to know if we're all being played. That landed harder than he meant it to. I could tell from the way Jenna closed her eyes for a second. I should have been angry. Maybe 10 years earlier I would have been. But anger takes energy, and by 35 I'd already spent too much of mine on things that mattered more. So I told him the truth. I'm not playing anything I said, and I'm not interested in convincing you. He looked at me as if that answer frustrated him even more than if I'd snapped back. Then why say it? He asked. Mad dog. Why not just brush it off? Because you asked. Frank gave the smallest nod, like that answer was exactly what he expected. Aunt Louise spoke up carefully. Frank, what did you hear exactly? He was quiet a moment, enough to remember the name. That's not an answer, Mark said. No, Frank replied, it's the answer you're getting. A younger cousin at the far end of the table, a boy in his 20s named Caleb, cleared his throat. Was it like from Afghanistan or something? I looked at him. He had that expression younger people sometimes wear around military stories, half respectful, half shaped by movies and headlines. He wasn't mocking, just unsteady in his understanding. Overseas, I said. That narrows it down, Mark muttered. Frank turned on him with surprising force. Would you listen to yourself? Mark stared back. I'm just asking questions. No, you're trying to win. That took the air out of him. It also settled something in me. Frank wasn't defending a myth. He was defending the principle that some people had earned the right not to be prodded for entertainment. Jenna looked from him to me. Evie, I really didn't know. I mean, I knew you served. I knew it was serious. But I didn't. You weren't supposed to, I said gently. Her eyes softened. Why? I glanced down at my plate. My food had gone cold and I hadn't noticed. Because when you tell civilians too much, they either turn it into a movie or they back away from you in church parking lots. Nobody had a response to that. In a room full of family, that may have been the loneliest sentence I'd spoken in years. Frank broke the silence. There was talk of a rescue operation, he said carefully. That's all I ever heard. A bad situation. Bad enough that people who knew better stopped talking when the name came up. Mark's mouth tightened. So there's no proof. I looked at him steadily. You need proof because you still think this is about status. He opened his mouth, but I kept going. It's not. That nickname wasn't something I picked. It wasn't a trophy. It was what people started calling me after a mission that cost too much. That did it. Not in some dramatic movie way. No gasps, no dropped glasses. Just the room settling around the fact that whatever this was, it wasn't fun anymore. Frank's voice turned quieter. That's what I figured. Mark looked at me for a long moment. For the first time since the evening began, his expression lost that smug edge entirely. In its place was something more human and less flattering. Embarrassment. Maybe even fear. Not fear of me exactly, fear of having walked into deep water thinking it was shallow. Jenna reached over and put a hand on his wrist, but he didn't look at her. He kept looking at me. I didn't know, he said. I believed him. That didn't make the damage disappear, but it mattered. Most family wounds don't begin with cruelty, they begin with carelessness. Frank leaned back and exhaled slowly. Then now you do. And with that, the whole table seemed to understand that the evening had crossed a line it wouldn't uncross. Not into spectacle, into truth. Mark swallowed once and said quieter now. What happened on that mission? I looked down at my hands. I hadn't planned on telling any of them. But some nights choose their own direction. I didn't answer Mark right away. There are questions that sound simple but aren't. Questions that pull on threads you've spent years tucking away. You don't refuse them because you're hiding something. You hesitate because once you start, you can't decide how much of it comes out. And once it's out, it doesn't belong to you anymore. The room waited. I could feel it, not pressure exactly, but expectation. Even Frank, who understood more than the others, didn't stop it this time. He just watched, steady and quiet, like a man who knew that sometimes truth has to be spoken in its own time. I rested my hands flat on the table. It wasn't one moment I said, "It never is." Mark didn't interrupt. That alone told me something had shifted. It started like most operations do, I went on. Information came in, incomplete, time-sensitive. There were civilians involved, Americans, contractors, aid workers. Wrong place at the wrong time. Caleb leaned forward slightly, but he didn't speak. We were told it was a recovery mission, I said. In and out, fast, controlled. I let out a quiet breath. That's what it was supposed to be. Jenna's fingers tightened around her napkin. What happened? She asked softly. I looked at her, not Mark this time. We got there, I said, and it wasn't what we were told. That sentence hung in the air longer than I expected. Frank gave a small knowing nod. The layout was wrong, I continued. The number of people inside was wrong. The level of resistance wrong. You plan for variables, but there's a difference between variables and being set up for something you weren't prepared to handle. Mark swallowed, eyes fixed on me now. Was it an ambush, he asked. Not exactly, I said, but close enough that it didn't matter. I could feel the memory pulling sharper now. Sounds, heat, the way time stretches and collapses at the same moment. We went in anyway, I said. Because that's the job. You don't get to stand outside and argue with bad intel while people are waiting inside. Nobody moved. We made contact, I said. Fast, loud, confusing. You don't see things clearly in those moments. You see shapes, movement. You hear voices, but they don't always make sense. I paused. You rely on training, on the people next to you. My voice slowed. And when something goes wrong, you feel it before you understand it. Jenna covered her mouth. What do you mean? She whispered. I looked down at the table. It means someone doesn't answer when they should, I said. It means a position that was supposed to be covered isn't. It means you realize in a split second that the plan you had is gone. Frank's eyes dropped briefly. He didn't need more explanation. Mark shifted in his chair, quieter now. Did you lose people? Yes. I didn't soften it. There are things you don't dress up. The room seemed to shrink around that word. Aunt Louise whispered, "Oh my Lord." I continued, not because I wanted to, but because stopping there would have turned it into something worse, something half-told and misunderstood. The first attempt failed, I said. We had to pull back. Mark frowned. You left. We had to, I said. We were compromised, injured, outnumbered. His expression tightened like he was trying to reconcile what that meant. And the hostages, he asked. I held his gaze. We left them there. Silence. Not uncomfortable this time. Heavy. Real. Caleb spoke before he could stop himself. But you went back. I looked at him. Yes. Frank's jaw shifted slightly. He already knew that part. Mark leaned forward, elbows on the table again, but this time there was no arrogance in it. You went back alone, he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Because that was the part people always focused on. Not the failure. Not the cost. Just the decision that came after. It wasn't supposed to happen that way, I said. No one plans to go back alone. That's not how it works. Then how did it happen? Jenna asked. I took a breath. Because leaving them didn't sit right, I said. That was the simplest version. The truest one, too. There are moments, I continued, when you can follow orders and still know you're going to carry something for the rest of your life. And there are moments when you step outside of that and accept a different kind of consequence. Mark stared at me. You disobeyed orders, he said. Yes. The word landed without apology. Jenna looked stunned. Evie. I knew what I was doing, I said. And I knew what it could cost me, not just professionally. Frank spoke quietly. But you went anyway. Yes. No one asked why again? They didn't need to. I leaned back slightly in my chair. It wasn't heroic, I said. It wasn't clean. It was messy and loud and uncertain, and the only reason I'm sitting here talking about it is because it worked. I let that sit for a second. Not perfectly, I added. Nothing like that ever is. Mark's voice came out lower now. You got them out. Yes. And that's why they called you. He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. I shook my head slightly. That's why they called me that, I said. Because I didn't stop. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Not in admiration. In understanding. That's not something people say lightly, he murmured. No, I said, it's not. The room had changed. Completely. Nobody was leaning back casually anymore. Nobody was smiling politely. The distance between people, the safe, comfortable distance that keeps conversations easy, was gone. Now we were all sitting in something closer. Something harder. Mark ran a hand over his face. I thought, he began, then stopped. What I asked? He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was no performance in his expression. I thought you were exaggerating, he said quietly. I know. That answer surprised him. You do? Yes? Why didn't you say anything? I gave a small, tired smile. Because people don't hear things until they're ready to. Frank nodded once more. That's true. Jenna reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of mine before she seemed unsure if she should touch it. Evie, I'm sorry, she said. For what? For not knowing, for all of this. I shook my head. You weren't supposed to know, I said again. That part hadn't changed. But something else had. The room wasn't judging anymore. It was listening. And Mark wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to understand. That was a start. But we weren't finished yet. Because understanding what happened is one thing. Understanding what it cost. That's something else entirely. Nobody spoke for a while after that. You could feel the weight of what had just been said settling into the room like dust after something breaks. Not chaotic, just different. Heavier. I picked up my glass and took a slow sip of water. It grounded me, brought me back to the table, to the people sitting there, to the fact that this wasn't a briefing room or a debrief or a report that would disappear into a file. This was family. Or something trying to become it. Mark cleared his throat. So, you just decided to go back, he asked. There was no challenge in his voice now, just disbelief, quiet searching. I didn't decide it the way you're thinking, I said. It wasn't a speech or a moment, it was a realization. What kind of realization, he asked. That I wasn't done, I said. He frowned. But you said the mission failed. It did. And you were ordered to pull out. Yes. He shook his head slowly. Then how do you justify going back? I looked at him carefully. I don't, I said. That stopped him. I don't justify it, I repeated. I live with it. That's the part most people don't expect. They want a clean answer, a reason they can agree with, something that makes everything line up neatly in their minds. But life doesn't work that way, not at 35, not after enough years of seeing how decisions ripple outward. Frank spoke quietly. There's a difference between justification and responsibility. I nodded once, exactly. Mark leaned back, absorbing that. So you went back, knowing you might not come out, he said. Yes. Why? I held his gaze. Because they wouldn't, I said. That landed differently than anything else I'd said. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just final. Jenna's eyes filled slightly, though she blinked it back. Aunt Louise reached for her hand under the table. Mark looked down at his plate again, then back up. He stopped searching for words. I've never had to make a decision like that. No, I said gently, most people don't. Frank let out a long breath. And that's something to be grateful for. Mark nodded faintly. I think I treated it like a story, he admitted, like something you'd tell at a bar, something exciting. That's how it looks from the outside, I said. And from the inside, I paused. From the inside, I said it's mostly waiting, and hoping the people next to you make it through the next 10 seconds. Nobody moved. The clock on the wall ticked loudly now. I hadn't noticed it before. Mark rubbed his hands together. I shouldn't have pushed you like that, he said, at the start. No, I said. He winced slightly at how direct that sounded. Then I softened it just a little. But you didn't know what you were pushing on, I added. That doesn't make it okay, he said. No, I agreed, but it makes it understandable. That seemed to matter to him. People his age, mid-40s, I guessed, still live in that space where they want to be, right? But they're starting to understand the value of being decent instead. Frank looked at him. What matters is what you do with it now. Mark nodded slowly. Then he looked at me again. I'm sorry, he said. This time it was different. No hesitation. No performance. Just a man admitting he'd misjudged someone sitting across from him. I studied him for a second. Then I nodded. Thank you. That was enough. We didn't need a bigger moment than that. Reconciliation, I've learned, doesn't come with applause. It comes quietly in small sentences that people mean. Jenna exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for the last 10 minutes. Okay, she said, forcing a small smile. Can we maybe try to eat before everything gets cold? A few people chuckled softly. It wasn't a return to normal, but it was a step toward something livable. Plates were passed again. Someone poured more water. The ordinary rhythm of dinner resumed, though more gently now, like everyone was aware of how quickly things could shift. Mark reached for the serving dish nearest him and passed it to me without a word. A small gesture. But a real one. Thanks, I said. He nodded. Across the table, Caleb asked Frank a quiet question about his time in Vietnam, and for the first time that evening the focus moved away from me. I was grateful for that. Not because I wanted to hide. Because I wanted to be part of the room again. Not the center of it. Frank answered Caleb slowly, choosing his words with care, not glorifying, not dramatizing, just telling the truth the way older Americans often do, plain steady without trying to impress anyone. I listened. And for the first time since I'd walked in, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not comfort exactly, but something close. Jenna leaned toward me. I really am glad you came, she said softly. I looked at her. I almost didn't, I admitted. She smiled. I'm glad you did anyway. Me too, I said. And I meant it. Because as uncomfortable as the evening had been, it had done something important. It had stripped away the surface. The assumptions. The easy judgments. What was left wasn't perfect. But it was honest. Mark cleared his throat again after a while. Can I ask you one more thing, he said. I glanced at him. You can ask. He hesitated, then said, Do you hate that nickname? That question surprised me. Not because of what it was, because of how he asked it. Carefully. Respectfully. I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered the truth. I don't hate it, I said. But I don't carry it the way other people think. What do you mean? I rested my hands on the table. It reminds me of what didn't go right, I said. Not just what did. Frank nodded almost to himself. That's the part civilians never see, he murmured. I looked at Mark. It's not something I bring to dinner, I said. He gave a small understanding nod. Yeah, he said quietly, I see that now. Outside, the sky had gone fully dark. The reflections in the window showed us all sitting there, older faces, younger ones, a mix of lives and histories that had just for a moment collided. Not perfectly. But honestly, and sometimes at this stage of life, that's enough. Dinner didn't go back to what it had been. It couldn't. But it settled into something better. Quieter, maybe. More deliberate. Like everyone at the table had been reminded that the people sitting across from them carried more than just polite conversation. Frank leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the armrests now instead of gripping the table. He looked older than he had an hour earlier, but not weaker, just more present. Caleb asked him something about where he had served, and Frank answered without embellishment. No dramatic pauses, no heroic framing, just dates, places, and the kind of details that matter more the older you get. I found myself listening closely. There's a kind of language veterans share even across generations. Not words exactly, more like the way things are said, the way certain moments are left unspoken because they don't need explaining. Jenna eventually stood and began clearing plates. "I'll get dessert started," she said, her voice a little brighter now, trying to bring warmth back into the room. "I'll help," I said, pushing my chair back. She shook her head. "You stay. You've done enough for one night." There was a softness in her tone that hadn't been there before. Respect. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that stays. I sat back down. Mark watched Jenna disappear into the kitchen, then looked at me. "Hey," he said low enough that only I could hear. I turned slightly toward him. "Yeah." He hesitated. Then almost awkwardly he said I meant what I said earlier. "I know," I replied. He nodded, then added, "I think I've spent a lot of my life thinking I understood people just by listening to them talk for a few minutes." I gave a faint smile. "That's most people." "Yeah," he said, "but I was wrong tonight. There wasn't much to say to that. So I just said that happens." He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but softer than before. "Not like this," he said. Across the table, Frank looked over at us, not interrupting, just aware. He had the look of someone who'd seen this kind of moment before, the kind that doesn't come often but matters when it does. Mark leaned forward slightly. "Can I ask you something else?" he said. "You've been doing that all night," I replied. This time there was a hint of humor in my voice. He caught it and smiled just a little. "Yeah, but this one's different." I nodded. "Go ahead." He lowered his voice. "How do you come back from that?" he asked. I knew exactly what he meant. Not the mission. Not the nickname. The life that comes after. I took a moment before answering. "You don't come back the same," I said. He frowned slightly. "Then what do you do?" "You build something new," I said, "piece by piece. You figure out what still fits and what doesn't." "That sounds hard." "It is." Frank spoke from across the table. "But it's also necessary." Mark glanced at him, then back at me. "Do people help?" he asked. I thought about that. "Some do," I said. "Some don't know how." "And tonight?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Tonight helped," I said. That seemed to mean more to him than anything else I'd said. He sat back, absorbing it. Jenna returned with a tray of dessert apple pie, still warm, with small bowls of vanilla ice cream. The smell filled the room, cutting through the heaviness in a way that felt almost symbolic. "Okay," she said, setting everything down. "I think we've all earned this." There were a few soft laughs. Plates were passed again. This time the conversation moved more naturally, not forced, not overly careful, just respectful. Aunt Louise asked me where I was living now. Caleb talked about his job. Someone mentioned the wedding again, and this time it didn't feel like a distraction. It felt like a reminder that life keeps moving forward even after difficult moments. I answered when spoken to. Listened when others shared. And slowly I stopped feeling like an outsider sitting at the table. After dessert I stood. "I'm going to step outside for a minute," I said. Jenna looked at me. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Just need some air." She nodded. "Take your time." I walked out through the front door and onto the porch. The night air was cool, quiet, a soft breeze moving through the trees lining the street. For a moment I just stood there. No voices, no questions. Just the sound of distant traffic and the faint rustle of leaves. I rested my hands on the porch railing. This was the part people don't talk about. Not the mission. Not the aftermath. But the in-between moments. The ones where you stand still and try to feel like you belong somewhere that doesn't require you to be anything other than human. The door opened behind me. I didn't turn. I already knew who it was. Frank stepped out beside me. He didn't say anything right away. Just stood there looking out at the quiet street. After a minute he said, "You handled that well." "I didn't handle it," I said. "It just happened." He nodded slightly. "That's usually how it goes." We stood in silence for a while. Then he said, "Coming home isn't easy." No, I agreed. Never was, he added. Different wars, same problem. I glanced at him. You still feel it? I asked. He gave a faint smile. Some days more than others. I understood that. He looked at me then. But nights like this help, he said. I considered that. Yeah, I said, they do. He nodded once. Then he said something that stayed with me. People don't need to understand everything he said, they just need to be willing to respect what they don't understand. I let that settle. Then I said, that's enough. He smiled. Yes, he said, it is. We stood there a little longer. Not talking. Not needing to. Inside I could hear voices again, softer now, warmer. Family. Not perfect, but real. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like something worth staying for. Morning came quietly. I woke up in the guest room with that unfamiliar stillness that only happens in someone else's house. No alarms, no radios, no distant hum of engines. Just sunlight filtering through the blinds and the faint sound of movement downstairs. For a few seconds I didn't remember where I was. Then it all came back. The dinner. The silence. Mark's face when he realized. Frank's voice cutting through the room. The way everything shifted after that. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the edge of the bed before standing. My body still carried habits from another life-wake-assess move. Even in a quiet Virginia home, those instincts didn't just disappear. But they softened. Little by little. I got dressed and stepped into the hallway. The house already smelled like coffee. That helped. Downstairs, Jenna was in the kitchen, standing by the stove with a mug in her hand. She turned when she saw me. Good morning, she said, smiling. Morning. You sleep okay? I did, I said, better than I expected. She nodded like she understood that meant more than just rest. I made coffee, she said, and there's some breakfast if you want. Coffee sounds good. I poured myself a cup and leaned lightly against the counter. For a moment we just stood there sharing the quiet. Then she said, last night. I looked at her. I'm really glad you stayed, she finished. So am I. She hesitated. I hope it didn't feel like we were putting you on display. It didn't, I said. That wasn't entirely true at first, but by the end it had changed. I think we all learned something, she added. I gave a small nod. Yeah. Mark walked in then slower than usual, like he'd been thinking before coming downstairs. He looked at me, then at Jenna, then back at me. Morning, he said. Morning? He stepped over to the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, then stood there for a second longer than necessary. Finally he turned. I've been thinking about what you said, he told me. Which part? All of it, he said, but mostly the part about not bringing that nickname to dinner. I held his gaze. That one tends to stick with people. He nodded. Yeah, it should. There was a pause. Then he said, I talked to Uncle Frank this morning. That didn't surprise me. And I asked. He told me I was lucky. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Lucky. Lucky I learned that lesson at a dinner table, he said. And not somewhere it would have cost me more. Frank would say something like that. Sounds about right, I said. Mark let out a small breath. I meant what I said last night, he added, about being wrong. I know. He looked at me for a moment, then said, I don't think I've ever really thought about what people carry with them. Not like that. That's most people, I said again. He gave a faint smile. Yeah, but I'd like to be better about it. That was the difference. Not perfection. Willingness. That's enough, I said. Jenna watched the exchange quietly, her expression soft. You two want breakfast, she asked, breaking the moment just enough to keep it from getting too heavy again. Sure, Mark said. I nodded. Yeah. Later that morning we sat at the same table. Same chairs. Same sunlight coming through the windows. But it felt different. Not tense. Not fragile. Just settled. Conversation came easier. Not forced, not careful, just real. Mark asked me about where I planned to go next, and this time it wasn't curiosity trying to prove something. It was interest. I told him I was considering staying in Virginia for a while, maybe working with a veterans support group, maybe something quieter. That sounds like you, Jenna said. I smiled faintly. I think it might be. Frank joined us halfway through breakfast, moving a little slower than the night before, but steady as ever. He took his seat, looked around the table, and gave a small nod. Better morning, he said. Yes, sir, Mark replied. Frank looked at him for a second, then smiled just slightly. "Good," he said. That was all. But it carried weight. By late morning, it was time for me to go. I stood near the front door, my bag in hand. Jenna hugged me again. This time I returned it without hesitation. "Come back for the wedding," she said. "I will." Mark stepped forward next. He hesitated for half a second, then held out his hand. I took it. "Drive safe," he said. "I will." Then after a brief pause he added, "And thank you." "For what?" "For not shutting me out," he said. I nodded once. "You gave me a reason not to." That seemed to stay with him. Frank walked me to the door. As I stepped outside, he said, "You did more than you think last night." I looked at him. "I just told the truth," I said. "That's usually enough," he replied. Then he added, "Take care of yourself." "I will." I got into my car and sat there for a moment, just like the night before. Same seat. Same steering wheel. But not the same feeling. The house behind me wasn't just a place I'd passed through anymore. It was somewhere I could come back to. I started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Mark and Jenna stood in the doorway, Frank just behind them. 3 different generations. 3 different lives. All changed just a little by one dinner. I don't think about the nickname much anymore. Mad Dog was never something I carried with pride. It was something I carried because I had to. But that night reminded me of something important. People don't need to understand everything you've been through. They just need to meet you with respect when they realize they don't. And sometimes if you're lucky, they learn. And they change. And so do you. If you've ever misjudged someone, or been misjudged yourself, maybe you understand how small moments can leave a lasting mark. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on the people around your own table, the ones you think you know. And maybe share this story with someone who might need the reminder. Because respect once given honestly has a way of coming back around. And those quiet lessons, they're the ones that stay.